I'd like to present our first speaker, Dr. Randall Noblitt. He is a clinical psychologist in private practice. He is has developed a lot of expertise, somewhat against his will, in the area of ritual and cult abuse. He's the author of a book to be published in August entitled Cult and Ritual Abuse, Its History, Anthropology, and Recent Discovery in Contemporary America. So without further ado, here's Dr. Noblitt.
Some of you may be wondering, though, at this point, okay, mind control, what does that have to do with cults? Since that word is associated with the topic for this conference, I wonder how many people out there think that there are groups, cults, whatever, where they practice, let's say, harmful, deviant, black magic, Satanism, not witchcraft in the sense of Wicca, but dark arts, so to speak. I wonder how many people think that. And some of you might be wondering, what is the connection between cults, witchcraft, Satanism, so on, and the mind control that you're going to be hearing a great deal about from the finest experts on that subject here. And that's an important point. And I'm hoping that if we accomplish one thing in this conference, it is that we get a clear sense about what is the connection, because there is a connection. But actually, this is an old story. And it's a story of trauma. It's a story of slavery. It's a story of the complete annihilation of other human beings when you can get away with it. It's a very, very sad story and has a long history. We can hear about that story and read about it in old documents, such as the Bible. The Bible talks about children passing through the fire. It talks about horrible things happening. And of course, many people may have just thought, well, that's kind of an interesting story, you know. What does it mean? What does it mean that Aztecs and that other Mesoamericans would flay people on an altar and consume their heart? What's that all about? Well, my argument is there's a thread that goes all through this. And if we want to go back in time, we can go all the way back to the worship of nature, shamanism, and so on. Trauma has always been viewed throughout history as a way of creating altered states of consciousness. Trauma, there are a variety of ways to create altered states of consciousness. Obviously, you can meditate, you can do hypnosis, you can listen to drums pounding and they'll kind of carry you off and they'll drift a little bit. But nothing really exciting happens. Nothing very impressive happens. It's my belief that many, many years ago, people learned that if you traumatize a person in a certain way, you can create the God that you worship. And so for that reason, many early religions, many very old religions included trauma in their worship. In fact, there's a book out, some of you may have seen it, it's called God is a Trauma. And it's particularly about some of the Gnostic traumatic practices that went back into ancient times. But we can carry this back even further than, say, the ancient times, ancient medieval times, back to, again, shamanism. Now, it's hard really to understand shamanism in detail now, the ancient version, because, again, many of these practices are pre-literate. We have no way to know exactly what people did. We just see these examples, for example, in the Mayan temples, and we know that these buildings were probably used for these purposes. But it's a little easier to understand it if we look into the shamanistic practices of modern times. For example, I wonder how many people here are familiar with the sun-gazing dance, or the sun dance, as it's called. Some of you are, okay. Well, this is still practiced in North America. Some of you may have seen the movie that came out some, I guess, 20 years ago, A Man Called Horse. And in the movie, I thought it was totally fictional because I didn't think you could ever get anybody who would agree to be lifted up but with hooks stuck in their pectoral muscles. I didn't figure a big line would establish with people waiting to do that. And I assumed it was totally fictional, but as it turns out, I was doing some reading on shamanism, and I read a modern day account, and I saw photographs of them doing the sun dance now, the sun gazing dance. Again, the idea is very simple, and I'll be talking about this more when I get into more programming in particular. To me, this is where programming begins, where people perhaps learned accidentally that the use of trauma and other kinds of ritual acts can produce dissociated states, can produce dissociated identities. That is, you can produce the deity, and many villages may have wanted to have their deity there, and it may have been a great honor for some child to go through these horrible procedures so that the village could have their deity right there with them. Well, through time, these practices passed through some changes, but not a whole lot. Many of you are probably aware of the mystery cults that existed around the Mediterranean during the ancient and up until the medieval times. Many of these involved traumatic rituals as well. And so now we have many people making allegations that some of the modern day remnants of these mystery cults, that is the fraternal organizations of modern times, engage in this kind of behavior as well. There are also many other pre-industrial cults. There's an excellent book by Oki, an African juju high priest, who writes about the traumatic ordeals that were used in his West African community on people, and he describes the dissociation that also occurs there. So these things are happening now. Now, some of you may wonder, though, okay, this makes sense, it's logical, and somewhere in there Satanism is a part, too. We hear so much about Satanism. Certainly, there must be some, I mean, where there's smoke, there's got to be something to that. So where's the connection with the U.S. government and other governments and CIA and military intelligence? I mean, doesn't this really sound awfully far-fetched? Well, we can go back to the Hellfire Clubs of England and Ireland in the 1700s, and we see a very clear connection there between governments, powerful members of governments, and bizarre, occult, or satanic, whatever you want to call it, dark kinds of activities. As many of you probably know, Ben Franklin was a visitor of the Hellfire Club in London, or outside of London. Additionally, the organization that was established in the outskirts of London was actually created by Sir Francis Dashwood, who shortly thereafter became the Chancellor of the Exchequer of Great Britain. In other words, he would be the equivalent of the Secretary of the Treasury. We're talking about top-level government. He was a personal friend to George III. I mean, very high-level government-type individual. And this was an individual who was carrying on in his residence bizarre practices that included blasphemous religious acts, bizarre sexual acts, and so on. Well, this is where we see a rather obvious beginning connection between governments and bizarre occult and other kinds of procedures like that. Aleister Crowley is another individual where we see a very clear connection between occultism, possibly Satanism, and governments. Crowley, of course, was involved with the British intelligence, as many of you know. And from men, we have this marriage made in hell, so to speak. In any case, there is a clear connection between the use of trauma in a ritualized manner and the development of dissociated individuals, the individuals that are coming forth that we're seeing nowadays clinically. We have many survivors who will be here telling their stories. We also will have some mothers who are protective mothers who are doing their best to try to protect children in extremely abusive environments. And they're finding out that the government, who is supposed to protect them, is doing just the opposite. We'll have time to talk about that as well. This is one of the great tragedies, is that something horrible is going on, but the people that we all should be able to trust to help us don't seem to be doing their job. And that is why it is my belief that we must have a citizens movement to correct this terrible wrong.